Well, this morning we're going to begin a study of the eighth fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of gentleness. Thus far this year, we have covered 7 of the fruits, so we're down to our last 2 over the next 2 months. And gentleness is an interesting term, an interesting choice of a fruit here, because the word translated gentleness will also get translated as meekness throughout the New Testament. And so when you come to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 23, most of the major English translations will identify that eighth fruit as gentleness. But if you're using a King James version or a few other lesser-known versions, you'll find the word meekness. The same thing happens when you go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5. One of the Beatitudes, actually the third Beatitude, says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." At least that's the English Standard Version, the King James, the New King James, and the New International Version. But if you go to the New American Standard Version and a couple of others, you'll hear it say, "Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth." These two terms are used interchangeably throughout the New Testament. And they are both appropriate translations of the term being employed here. And I provide that little nuance up front because as we study gentleness over the next couple of weeks, we will encounter some verses that your translation might change to meekness. And I just want you to be aware of that ahead of time. I also want you to be aware that not only is gentleness or meekness a fruit of the Spirit, but it's also a descriptor of how we are to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which we have been called, as Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1 and 2 says. It's a character trait that should be evident to everyone, according to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5. It's something God's chosen ones are to put on or clothe themselves with in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12. It's a quality of a shepherd or an elder in the church according to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3. It's something a man or a woman, for that matter, of God should pursue according to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 11. It's a mark of unfading inner beauty of holy women according to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 4. And it's the basis for how we restore our spiritual brothers and sisters in Galatians chapter 6, how we correct our opponents in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and how we communicate the reason for our hope in 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, I realize you're not going to retain all those verses I just threw at you. In fact, you probably didn't have time to read all the verses I just threw at you. But the reason I put them up there is I want you to realize gentleness is a bigger deal in the Bible than we sometimes give it credit for. It's mentioned and referenced many times in relationship to how we're supposed to live as followers of God. It is an unavoidable expectation of those who profess Christ. But despite the frequency with which gentleness or meekness gets mentioned in the New Testament, it remains one of the most misunderstood characteristics of a disciple. That's because gentleness and meekness are not valued in our society. In fact, if you were to go pull up Merriam-Webster's dictionary on the word gentle, because gentleness will be defined as the quality or state of being gentle, so you have to go to gentle to get the definition. Notice some of the things it is defined as. Being docile, being soft, being delicate. Are those attributes we value in our culture? Or think about meekness. Go look up the definition of meekness. It's defined as being deficient in spirit and courage, as being not violent or not strong. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you men out there want to be known for your gentleness? Raise your hand. Yeah, that's what I thought. It is not an attribute we admire in general, for all people at least. So when we hear the word gentle or meek, we have a tendency to think of someone who is timid or someone who is spineless, someone who lacks courage, someone who doesn't know how to stand up for himself or herself, someone who's weak, frail, and for all intents and purposes is a doormat to society. That's our picture of meekness. And I can still remember when I was in middle school, and my favorite sport being basketball, my favorite player at the time was Charles Barkley. Now listen, I understand Michael Jordan was the best player of all time. Never argue with me on that because I'll win every time. But I love Charles Barkley coming out of the Olympics, going to the Suns. For some reason, I was fascinated with his size and yet his ability to do athletic things. And I remember this ad coming out from Nike. Nike put out this ad showcasing Charles Barkley. And it says, "The meek may inherit the earth, but they won't get the ball." And the idea behind that advertisement was that if you want to be successful, then you can't waste your time being gentle or weak, gentle or meek. And this resonated with me because as a young Christian, I knew it was quoting Scripture. And I knew it was declaring the exact opposite of what Jesus declared. And in my mind, I was always thinking, well, what then is meek? Because it sure sounds like something I don't want. And so this morning, let's define gentleness. Let's define meekness. Let's understand these concepts and why they are praised in a beatitude, why they are identified as a fruit of the Spirit. And to do that, we need to turn our attention to one place where Jesus specifically used the term. We read it a moment ago, but I'd like to read it again, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The great invitation, so to speak, from Jesus. And he goes on to say, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, there are two basic observations I really want you to take home with you today from this passage. The first is that Jesus identified himself as gentle. Jesus says, "I am gentle." Now, I want you to think for just a moment. Actually, before you think, let me reference one more verse. Not only does Jesus say he is gentle, but inspired authors of Scripture declared it. If you journey over to the book of Matthew, to the 21st chapter, we read about Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. And we're told this event fulfilled a prophecy proclaimed by Zechariah. I think in Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. But the way Matthew quotes it, he says it this way. In Matthew chapter 21, verse 5, he says, "See, your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey and on a calf, the foal of a donkey." A prophet from the Old Testament declared Jesus to be gentle. An inspired author of the New Testament seconded that. So Jesus doesn't just say it about himself. Others, through the inspiration of God, are saying it about him too. And if you recall in that passage, when he says, "Come to me," he says, "Learn from me, for I am gentle." He's saying, I am the standard of gentleness. If you want to know what it is to be gentle, just come follow me. Now I want you to think. When you contemplate the character and life of Jesus, do you think he was a pushover? Do you think he was a coward? Do you think he was timid? Do you think he lived like a doormat? In Mark chapter 11, in an event recorded almost immediately after he rode into town on that donkey, we read that Jesus went to the temple courts, and there he discovered a marketplace. People buying and selling, trading, making profits. In the very place where worship was supposed to occur, in a place that Jesus would in a moment say was a house of prayer for all nations, he looked around and discovered that they had made it a Walmart. You could buy anything you needed there. You could do your banking there. It was a Walmart. And that commerce he saw taking place in the temple courts was out of place, in a place where worship was intended to occur. So Jesus, Mark tells us, overturned the tables of the money changers and overturned the seats of those who were selling pigeons. John's gospel in John chapter 2 will add that he made a whip, and he drove out all of the oxen and the sheep that were present there to be bought and to be sold and bought for sacrifices. And like a rancher, he drove them out of the temple courts. When you picture Jesus in this scenario, does he look weak? Does he look timid? Does he look like a pushover? I don't think so. But let me give you another story. This one's recorded in John chapter 18, the first 8 verses. It's the account of his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, one thing we have to acknowledge up front. We have to acknowledge that he to some degree turned himself in. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't try to run from the police. He didn't deny his involvement with he didn't deny who he was, I should say. It wasn't about involvement, it was about identity. He didn't deny who he was. He didn't seek to get out of the arrest. He willingly identifies himself. Look at what happens here in John chapter 18. Judas brings a band of soldiers who are carrying torches and weapons out to arrest Jesus. And when they arrive on the scene, Jesus' first words are, "Whom do you seek?" You notice he even says it correctly. He didn't say who. That was supposed to be funny. Whom do you seek? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. What does he say? That's me. And the text tells us that they fell backward, amazed. Now, maybe there's something powerful going on here behind the scenes that we can't grasp in the text. Or maybe they're just astonished he admitted it. Maybe they're surprised that he was so quick to identify himself, knowing why they're there and how other people would handle the situation. They would cower, they would hide, they would run, they would deny, but not Jesus. You see, in this moment, I don't think Jesus is timid. I don't think Jesus lacks courage. I don't think Jesus is weak. He's a man taking it like a man, with the awareness of the divine plan. You see, when I look at stories like this and really spend time with them, they lead me to the conclusion that Jesus wasn't a coward or a pushover. There's no presence of timidity in him. Based on the fact that Jesus said, I am gentle, told us to learn from him, and the gospel accounts present him with courage and boldness and an unintimidated mindset, I think it's safe to conclude that gentleness is not equivalent to weakness. You see, the call to be gentle is not a call to be a spineless doormat that just gets trampled on by everybody. The call is to be gentle is a call to be like Jesus. So when you look at Matthew chapter 11 and Jesus says, learn from me for I am gentle, start there. Look at the character and the life of Jesus and know that gentleness does not mean you get walked on. Gentleness does not mean you're a coward, because Jesus was neither of those things. But also go to Matthew chapter 11 and notice the analogy he employs. Because Jesus in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, associated gentleness with a yoke. A yoke. I know we're not an agricultural society like we used to be, but a yoke, if you don't know, is that tool binding the neck or necks of animals to control them. So, for example, you might have a pair of oxen that you're going to use to plow a field, and to keep them moving in a straight line together, you use a yoke, that crossbeam that goes across their necks. What's interesting is that the word yoke that appears here was used in the days of Jesus to refer to the taming of an animal. When you took an animal like an ox or a horse, and you broke it, and you tamed it, and you domesticated it, you would say that that animal is now meek or gentle, because their size and their might and their energy was now under your control. So the original idea behind the word gentle was the surrender of one's might, the surrender of one's emotions, the surrender of one's energy to the will of its master. And Jesus modeled this type of gentleness. Remember that whole cleansing of the temple episode I mentioned earlier? Well, I pulled up John's account this time. But think about the fact that it may not seem gentle because it's physical. He's overturning tables. He's driving animals out of the temple courts. But the gentleness in the episode is evident in the fact that he didn't physically attack anyone. That whip he made was solely used on the animals. The tables he overturned were inanimate objects, not people. His actions were directed at the activities, not the individual agents involved. It was for them to learn and for them to be corrected, but he wasn't harmful or violent in the scenario. And there's another little detail that appears particularly in Mark's account back in Mark chapter 11. What's interesting is that when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on that donkey, he immediately went to the temple. He witnessed what was happening there. But you know what? That's not when he acted. That's not when he got the whip out and started throwing things around the temple. No, he went back to Bethany for the night. And he slept on it. And it's the next morning that he gets up and goes to the temple and cleanses it, as we've talked about today. What I want you to realize is that Jesus' activity in the temple, divinely inspired, of course, was not spontaneous, was not an emotional reaction in the moment. It was measured. It was thought out. It was intentional. Jesus, after seeing what was going on in the temple courts, went home, thought about it, how he should handle it. It may not seem gentle on the surface, but it was, because it wasn't just a reaction. It was measured, and it was intentional in that it wasn't harmful to any person. And I would argue not harmful to any animals. And remember the Garden of Gethsemane, his arrest? Matthew's account reveals the gentleness in that scenario when we get over to Matthew chapter 26. It's interesting, after the soldiers arrive, Peter grabs his sword and starts swinging. He chops off a servant's ear, and that's when Jesus stops him. Jesus prevents him from shedding any more blood. And you know what Jesus says to Peter? Pay attention to it. You've heard it before, more than likely. But it appears there in verse 52 and 53. Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? Do you realize the gentleness of Jesus? In this moment, he could make one request, and an army of angels would descend and decimate, destroy, kill anyone who's opposed him if he wanted it. He had the power to request that, and he knew that request would be fulfilled. That's gentleness, that's restraint to not request it. That's strength under control, domesticated, so to speak, by his Father's will. He could have prevented every bit of this, and he deliberately restrained that desire because it wasn't consistent with the Father's will. He was tamed by his master. And I think this understanding of strength under control, of being tamed, is especially evident when you consider the antithesis of gentleness. You go back to Galatians chapter 5, where we get the fruits of the Spirit. You see the fruits in verse 22 and 23. They are immediately preceded by the works or desires of the flesh. And if you pay attention to the way Paul sets all this up, he says that the desires of the flesh are opposed to the desires of the Spirit in verse 17. That means that to some degree the fruits of the Spirit can be defined by their opposites in the desires of the flesh. And if you look at verse 20 and 21 of Galatians chapter 5, you'll notice enmity or hatred. You'll notice discord and jealousy and fits of rage and selfish ambition and dissensions, factions, envy. Those qualities are diametrically opposed to gentleness. You can't be gentle and be filled with hate or jealousy or envy. You can't be gentle and have fits of rage or cause dissensions and cause factions. They just don't go together. So the fruit of gentleness is the Spirit's taming of our natural inclinations toward those desires of the flesh. It's about allowing ourselves to be controlled by God, domesticated by God. Gentleness did not refer to a person who is weak or spineless. It referred to a person who had brought his or her strength under the control of his master. Isn't that what disciples are called to do? Luke chapter 9, verse 23 and 24. If anyone would come after me, Jesus says, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Gentleness is about bringing ourselves under the control of God. Your strength, your talents, your energies, your emotions, your thoughts, whatever it is, gentleness is about letting Him control them instead of letting your physical desires control them. Speaking of taming of animals, isn't it fascinating? Fascinating that mankind has been able to tame some of the biggest and most violent creatures on the earth. In Thailand, you can go ride elephants. This massive mammal that could squash you like a bug can be so controlled, so tamed, so gentle that you can hop on its back and go for a ride through a river. Or think about killer whales. I know there's that one really obvious bad incident down there at SeaWorld, but for decades, these massive sea creatures have been performing for audiences because they've been trained by humans. Or if you think about bears, you can get a bear to ride a scooter? You can go see animals like bears in circuses. I don't know if you can in the U.S. anymore, but around the world, I think it still happens, at least according to the pictures I got off of Shutterstock. There are people who raise bears. There are people who have bears as pets. There are people in Hollywood who own bears and train bears so that they can be in movies. I mean, we've even accomplished this. Mankind has been able to tame animals that we should fear. We've been able to bring them to a degree under our control. And the concept of gentleness, the fruit of gentleness, is us surrendering to God in that same way, allowing Him to have control, allowing Him to tame us so that we don't pursue the desires of the flesh. Instead, we produce the fruits of the Spirit. Gentleness is not about weakness. It's about bringing your strength under the control of someone stronger. So don't be afraid to pursue gentleness. Realize you're expected to. Realize that's your calling. Realize that Jesus is gentle, and you're expected to be like Him. So pursue that gentleness, understanding that it's not about being a coward, it's not about being weak, it's not about being timid, it's about being controlled by God. And if you refuse that, you're refusing the Lord. This morning we invite you to be tamed by the Father, to welcome gentleness in your life. It all starts by putting on Christ in baptism, as Galatians chapter 3 will talk about. That's how you become a part of the family of God, when you're immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. That's the starting point. If you haven't made that decision to profess the name of Christ, to declare that He is the Son of God who has risen from the grave, repenting of your sins, acknowledging that you are a sinner, and choosing to abandon that way of life and surrendering to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ through the waters of baptism, hey, you can become a part of that family. And you can start your gentle journey. If you've already made that decision, you may find yourself struggling with the fruit of gentleness. But realize this. Gentleness might be the fruit that makes us the most distinct from the world around us, but it also might be the fruit that we fail at the most and imitate the world around us the most. Maybe right now, as a child of God, the one fruit you struggle with the most is gentleness. If it is, don't hesitate to acknowledge it. Come confessing that you struggle with it. Come acknowledging that you need His help. Because guess what? The fruits of the Spirit aren't something that you just push through and make happen on your own. You need the Spirit's help. That's why it's the fruits of the Spirit, not the fruits of you. Maybe you need to seek that assistance this morning. And as the family of God, we want to help, lift you up in prayer, support you in that endeavor. Whatever your need is this morning, we extend this invitation to pursue gentleness today. If you need to respond to that invitation, we invite you to come while together we stand and sing.